What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I just finished reading Thrawn Ascendancy Greater Good by Timothy Zahn, and I wanted to give you guys my thoughts on it with it fresh in my memory just having finished it. And I've seen conflicting thoughts and reviews on this book from different reviewers on the internet. I've listened and watched plenty of reviews, and I've heard people saying that they think this book's okay, but it's not one of the best Thrawn books. I've heard some people saying that it is the best Thrawn book. And I've just heard many conflicting opinions. Now, some of you may be surprised by this, but this might be my favorite Thrawn book. I am just really surprised by how much I ended up liking this book by the end of it. And I think the real reason why I liked this one a lot more, this book's very recent, so those of you who are interested in reading it, I'm not going to talk spoilers or really talk any plot specifics because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who may not have gotten the chance to read it yet. But just the way that this book was written just really pulled me in. I from the beginning, I wasn't super invested. It picks up right off of where the first Thrawn book, Chaos Rising, ends, and you know, that plot, I enjoyed Chaos Rising, but now having this book, looking back in retrospect, it does feel like a book dedicated to setting up the world of the Chiss Ascendancy and the characters so that you would be more acquainted with them getting into the second and third books, which is where the real meat and where the real story kicks in. Because, you know, it was important to acquaint us with the Chiss Ascendancy and these characters, because in the canon Thrawn trilogy set during the time of the Empire and during Star Wars Rebels, it's alluded to, and the Chiss Ascendancy is alluded to and talked about, and we even see Arlani and a few characters from the Chiss Ascendancy appear in Rebels, or in the new canon Thrawn trilogy. We don't really see what it's like, how it operates. So that first book was important, but here they're able to acquaint us much more with the characters. And this book, I don't know if it's just me or not, but this book feels far more character focused than the first one. There are a lot of different characters that they introduce who may seem kind of random at first. And when I started this book, I was kind of on the side of the people I'd heard reviewing it saying it was the weakest Thrawn book. They were throwing so many plot elements at me and so many different characters and stories, and it was kind of confusing. Just by general definition, I found the first book a little bit difficult to read because of, you know, just all the names and the families of the Chiss Ascendancy and just the hierarchy and all this. It just got a little bit confusing in remembering which of the characters it was. I don't know if it was just having read the first book going into this one and I was more used to it, or maybe it was just Timothy Zahn, through his writing, being able to communicate all of these elements more clearly in this book, but because of the more character-focused nature, I felt I was more able to get invested in it, and it wasn't, you know, like, in some ways, it feels more large-scale than the first book, but in many ways does feel somewhat smaller scale because it's told mostly from the perspective of characters and not from, like, the Chiss Ascendancy. Like, in the first book, a lot of it was kind of told from these political leaders like General Bakif and a lot of different political leader characters. But this book, it's told mainly from the perspective of multiple different characters. One of them's literally just a farmer guy on a ranch on one of the moons in the Ascendancy from a member of one of these less popular Chiss families called Lackfro, I believe is his name. And he ended up, by the end of it, being one of my favorite characters and ends up being kind of a heroic character. And I just kind of like those characters with humble beginnings who end up becoming kind of real heroes by the end. And I really enjoyed his aspect of, or his perspective of, like, on the story. And throughout the book, all these plot elements build, and you see the pieces begin to form. And then eventually it leads to this really epic climax where you really feel the consequences. Now, the reason I feel the consequences are felt more in this book is because in the canon Thrawn trilogy set during the time of the Empire, Thrawn's always talking about how, oh man, this species might be a threat to the Empire and therefore is a threat to the Ascendancy. They might be a threat. But then whenever they were fighting them in those books, they were always fighting them off in like some region of space where they weren't an immediate threat to anyone at that specific point in time. So it didn't really feel like anything was a threat. But in this book, they keep bringing in all these different enemies and allies and all these different characters, and they're always kind of confusing at first because you don't know whose side they're on and who, like, they're working with or who they're working for, and there's just a lot of interesting kind of alliances and shaky alliances and different things going on in the book, and it's just, it all feels more, personal, which makes the stakes feel higher than in those other books where it was just, oh, this might be a threat, this might be a threat. Here you're seeing it all from a personal level, and now having a relationship with the Chiss Ascendancy and having seen how it operates within the first book, you're now able to see and feel the stakes because it's told from the perspective of the Ascendancy and the characters within it. So these events feel like they're really building to something. The book also feels way darker than the other ones. I don't know if that was just like my perspective on it, but there were parts in this book that kind of legitimately kind of disturbed me, and I thought they were kind of gross. Like there's this character Haplif of the Agbui or something. I don't know how to pronounce his last name or his species name, but he gets introduced in the book working for this kind of primary antagonist character. And at first I was kind of like, what's the point of this character? Because they even dedicate all the flashback chapters. Like I said, in the first book, Chaos Rising, there were chapters called Memories, where it would be telling something in the past from Thrawn's perspective and then explaining how it is affecting them in like current day, like an alliance they made in the past, and then they introduce that character that they had an alliance with in the past and brings them into the present. But in this book, you're seeing Haplif, this like kind of once again antagonist character, and you're seeing kind of all the events that were happening, and they aren't as far in the past as they were in the first book. They're relatively recent, and there's kind of this plot element that is introduced with him and the experience that he was going through shortly before you see him introduced in current day, and it becomes a little bit disturbing because things become more and more severe and dark, and you're very worried as to how it's going to end, and eventually it culminates, and you're just like, oh man, like it's just a really gross kind of disturbing moment when you realize what's really going on. And then, just everything kind of builds slowly. It's a very slow building book. Some people might not like that. The other Thrawn books were always kind of action oriented. In this book, there are a few battles throughout it, and they're kind of the typical Thrawn fanfare that you have, the typical Thrawn battles where he predicts them and he comes out on top. But then by the end of this book, all the stakes build, all these different plot elements they set up build, and there's just this huge payoff that I found very satisfying, and you really feel the stakes, and you're really wondering if Thrawn is going to make his way through this, because this main antagonist character, Jixtus, is this, once again, another very tactically capable character, and in some ways is more capable than Thrawn, because they talk about this again in this book, is that Thrawn is very military, tactfully capable, but he is not politically capable. He has no idea about politics. He doesn't understand them, and that's always his oversight. And this character, Jixtus, is able to see through that. He has a better understanding of politics than Thrawn does, and in some ways is able to surpass him in that department in terms of his tactics. So this plan that Jixtus has been concocting throughout the book, when it comes to this like big battle at the end, in the midst of battle, this new character, Lakinda, that they introduce, who's now one of my favorites and has a very interesting arc in it, is able to realize that, the one oversight that Thrawn had was a political oversight, and that was something this character, Jixtus, had actually put into consideration while concocting his plan. And it's able to show how this is the first person in any of these books, I guess besides Palpatine in the new trilogy, who has really been able to outsmart Thrawn. And I'm really interested to see how that's going to come into play in the last book. And like I said, once again, there are just these very interesting characters they introduced, like Lakinda, this character who's a member of a lesser Chiss family, or a family of the Chiss that is regarded as lesser by many of them because they're like the 40 great Chiss families, and she's not one of them. And there's this opportunity that is given to her to, I guess, prove her, loyalty and prove how strong her family really is. But then it also ends up becoming in some ways a detriment to the Chiss Ascendancy as a whole, and they play around with the idea of loyalty that was present in the current Thrawn books, or the Thrawn books set during the time of the Empire. It was played around with in Thrawn alliances and Thrawn treason, the aspect of where do your loyalties truly lie, Thrawn? Do they lie with the Empire or with the Chiss Ascendancy? I liked the way those concepts were played around with there, But I kind of liked them even more here because, once again, it's a more personal perspective on the Chiss. And, this character Lakinda goes through a very interesting arc throughout the book where she goes from this very stoic character and then this character who's willing to make a certain decision by the end of the book. And to me, it hit harder than really the way those themes were executed in the Thrawn trilogy, like the recent Thrawn trilogy set during the time of Rebels and the Empire. And I don't know, just something about the way those themes were executed here just kind of hit harder, and it felt more satisfying. And once again, the stakes felt higher. They felt like, I felt a real sense of dread and tension going into the finale of this book because they built up these antagonists as being a real threat, and you were wondering if Thrawn was really going to make it out. And that's one of the few times in these books where I've really felt like, man, I wonder if Thrawn is going to be able to do this, because in these other books, we know what's going to happen to Thrawn. We know what happens to him by the end of Rebels, and it's the same thing here. This is a prequel series. We know what happens. We know Thrawn won't die. But there are all these other characters that they've acquainted us with that we care about, and you're actually concerned for their safety by the end of it. I was wondering if Lakinda would make it out alive. And I feel like this book really hit a better sense of tension, and the darker tone of this book does help with that. Now, not everything about this book hit home for me perfectly. There were certain plot elements, like the main plot element that is introduced from the beginning of the book doesn't really have a resolution by the end. It does tie into the whole scheme that Jixtus has been concocting, but it doesn't really have a resolution. They set up the resolution, and maybe like a page or two at the end of the book would have worked well. I'm sure Zahn will close off that plot point in the last book, but it felt like that wasn't really resolved. And then there's also this second plot point going on with two of these different kind of members of the Aristocry, I believe, Zistelmu and Thurfian, and they don't really resolve their plot point. They're kind of, throughout the book, coming up with schemes to try and dethrone Thrawn because they don't like him. They want to defame him. They think he's kind of a rot in the Ascendancy. Everyone else likes him, but they don't. So by political means, they're trying to manipulate these different, parties to try and defame Thrawn. And there's this one attempt that they have, and you don't really see the effects of that. You don't really see how that attempt goes. And it's weird because they do bring those characters back at the end of the book, and they set up more stories to be told with them in the third book and for their stories to be continued there, but it does feel like there wasn't really a resolution to that one either. It just kind of, the book became more concerned with these other major stories and kind of forgot about that, which I'm not super disappointed in because I found that aspect to be kind of one of the weaker points, just these guys trying to defame Thrawn even though they kind of know that they're not going to succeed. And it wasn't bad, but it wasn't my favorite part of the book, so it doesn't really bother me that much, but at the same time I have to acknowledge that it is kind of an inconclusive story, and it is a little bit weird how they didn't really conclude that. But besides that, this may be my favorite Thrawn book. It is very hard-locked on the Chiss Ascendancy and this world and the characters within it. It feels far more character-focused and ground-level than the first one, and having that first one, having given context, they're able to let the full narrative of this series play out and set itself up for the next book. I've heard people saying this book feels mostly like setup. I feel like that's a little bit of a strange criticism because I suppose in a way it is meant to be set up, but at the same time, most books, like middle books, are meant to be set up. It feels like the first book was actually kind of mostly set up, and this is where we're getting to the real meat of the narrative. And I was just really pleased with how it played out. I think this may be my favorite Thrawn book because, once again, it's just the tension felt higher, and having this real personal perspective from the Chiss Ascendancy really lent itself well to the book. It was able to rely just solely on the Chiss Ascendancy and how it played out. That's something that I praised about the first book, was how detached it felt from the rest of the Star Wars narrative. But even then, that book did have kind of the cameo from Anakin that ties into Thrawn alliances, which I didn't know at the time when I reviewed that book. But having read this book, there is one offhand mention of Anakin Skywalker at the beginning of this book, and the rest of it, there are no tie-ins. There's only one tie-in, sort of, at the end of the book, but it's just a name that will be familiar to anyone who has read the other canon Thrawn trilogy, but it feels more like it's set up for the next book in the narrative. It will probably tie into the new canon Thrawn trilogy in a way, the sequel trilogy to this, but it doesn't really feel like it's kind of meant as a big reveal, and it will be to those reading it who have read the other series, but it's not really like a big thing for the rest of the Star Wars narrative. There's one offhand mention of Anakin, but there's no big tie-ins to the Star Wars galaxy. It's very hard locked on this book, and Zahn was able to express his full creative freedom with this one, and it worked for me. I really enjoyed this book. Like I said, I always love when creators are able to get their own creative vision out there without restrictions, and it feels like Zahn is not restricted as much as he was with the other Thrawn trilogy that was taking place at the same time of Rebels, because he had to kind of tie everything in before the end of Rebels because he couldn't go beyond that point. But here it feels like he's less restricted. Despite it being a prequel, he's able to do a lot of creative things and play around with a lot of interesting themes and aspects of Star Wars that we've never seen before. And I just really enjoyed this book. It was very expansive, very, I enjoyed reading it from start to finish, I'd say. At first, once again, it was a little slow, but then by the end of it, you realize that was the point and that it was really building to something. And I'm really looking forward to Thrawn Ascendancy Lesser Evil coming out in November. And once that book comes out, I want to kind of do a tier list or ranking of all these books. Once again, it's hard for me to choose from the 5 Thrawn books we have so far, but I would say so far this might be my favorite. It's a very strong book. It is one of the best Thrawn books. I'd say it's better than Chaos Rising, Alliances, and Treason. It might not be better than the first Thrawn book, based, once again, before Rebels, but I'd have to kind of read that one again to revise my thoughts, but I really loved Thrawn Ascendancy Greater Good, and if you are fans of the character of Thrawn and Star Wars, once again, of course, I'd recommend you read it. And with that said, that's pretty much it for my thoughts on Thrawn Ascendancy Greater Good. You guys, please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.